Hi everybody, it's Susan from Sunrise Quilt Studio, and today I am getting ready to make binding for the Sew by Row quilt. So I've got my binding strips here, and I've got my iron and my sewing machine. You all probably know how to put on binding, so it's not a tutorial or anything. This is just more of a chat because I don't have a whole lot to do a tutorial on right now. I'm still in the middle of packing things up and decluttering the house. The studio is pretty much done. I think I will go through things a little bit more and try and condense things right now. So it's kind of the stage that I'm at the moment, and it's just been busy around here. If you've ever gone through a move, you know how hectic that can be. So I have the binding strips, and I think I have more binding here than what I need, but that's okay. I'm just going to sew all these strips together and just use what I need. This is of course Lori Holt fabric, and this is the fabric that was in the kit to use for the binding. So this is what I'm using, and it's pretty blue-green color, pretty teal, turquoisey color. And I'd sew my bindings together with a diagonal seam. So I'm just going to go from corner to corner, and I overlap them. Let me show you here. Here is the selvage edge on this one, the selvage edge on that one. So I overlap them like this, so the selvages are outside the seam where I'm going to sew from here to here. Or actually it's going to be sewn from here to here. And that way I know to start right here at that junction and end right here at that one. I don't draw lines on the binding. I can tell by lining this up with the line where the selvage ends. I know that I've got that straight. So I'm going to use a 2.5 seam allowance or stitch length. And you could use a guide here if you want. I have my tape here, so let me put a piece of tape on. And then once, I usually do all the sewing first, and then I will trim. But what I'm going to do is just trim it down to 1/4 of an inch. So I have that, and then when I pull it out, I've got straight binding. So I have some glow line tape, so I'm going to put a piece down, and that'll give me a guide, make sure I've got everything straight. Sounds like elephants upstairs, but I think that was actually just my daughter, and she's not very big. It's just echoey down here. Okay, so just grab another strip, and I'm going to add that. Then I'm going to take this in, and I'm going to flip it right side up, and then take the next one, put it right side down. Line them up. Just pull that out a little bit. This is, I think this is a B Basics because it's got a copyright of 2017 here on the selvage, so I'm thinking that's one for basics. So that's just a guess. I'd have to look it up to make sure, but I think that's what that is. Oh, another thing, a friend told me of a storage place that has units that are 20 feet long. So if I can get one of those, I could store my long arm table there. So that would be great. So I have to call them tomorrow and see what they have available. And then, as my husband says, now we just have to figure out a way to get it there. We don't have a truck. And the table's 14 feet long, so that's pretty long. So I don't know how we'll get it there, but I don't know. Lots of little problems to work out. Okay. Now I'm going to cut the chains. And then I'll trim off the extra fabric there. Let's see if I got any more over here. Okay. So I'll trim these all down, and then I'll open that seam allowance, and then I'll press this in half. Seam allowances are the width of your binding, is a personal preference on what you like. For me, it depends on what kind of batting I'm using and how densely I've quilted the quilt. I have done quilts with heirloom quilting, which is really super dense quilting, and 2 1/4 inch or 2 1/2 inch wide binding is just way too big. So that I'll do some tests on with a couple of samples and decide if I need like 2 inches, 2 1/8, or less. And with most of my quilts, I use an 80-20 batting, and I just kind of do a medium density quilting, and 2 1/8 inch of width for my binding is good. So that's what I have on this one, is 2 1/8. But so a lot of it all depends on what kind of batting you have and how dense your quilting is. Now, if you have a real thick polyester batting, you might need 2 1/4 or 2 1/8, depending on how densely you've got it quilted and how dense it is in that seam allowance there. So that's kind of all up to the quilt and the quilter. Of course, you can do this trimming with a rotary cutter. To me, it's just easier to do it this way. Since I'm sitting here, my scissors are here, I don't have to get up and go to my cutting table. Okay. So now I'm going to press these seam allowances open and fold it in half, and then I have my seam binding, or my binding ready to put on the quilt. And I have my quilt folded up, and it's sitting on my cutting table over there, and it's a big quilt, so it's going to be a little bit of a chore to get that through the sewing machine here, because my table isn't very long. It's only a 4-foot table, so it's not very long, so there's not much room for the quilt to rest on, but it'll get done. Okay, so I'm going to, this is easier to do on my regular ironing board too, but today I'm going to do it here. So I'm just going to fold it in half and press it, and then when I come to a seam allowance, I'll press it open. And I'm going to pull my chair over so that this can all just pool on the chair and not hit the floor and get dirty, because the floor is not the cleanest right now with all the packing and sorting I've been doing, so I don't want the binding to get dirty. Okay, here's the seam allowance. So I'm just going to open it up. Okay, one reason I like the diagonal seam right there is because when you fold this over, you've got a seam here and a seam here, so you have less bulk than if they both lined up against each other. And then when you pull that around, you don't have as much fabric to work with, if that makes any sense, because of the bulk taking up space. So this just makes it easier. But there are times when I do use a straight seam, like if I'm really short on fabric and I just barely have enough to get around the quilt, then I'll do the straight seams. Or if I'm having to match stripes or plaids, then a lot of times the straight seam works easier. It's easier to get that matched up before you sew your pieces together. And this is a lot of binding. Okay, my air is about to kick on. I've had a few minutes where it wasn't on, but it's going to get noisy, so I'm going to go ahead and turn off the camera, and then I'll be back when I'm ready to sew this onto the quilt. Okay, so I'm going to fast forward through part of this. I'm not going to show you the whole video of me putting the binding on because it's extremely long. This is a big quilt, but you notice I leave a pretty good length of the binding at the beginning that I don't have attached, and that's to give me room where I can attach the ends together when I get around to that end. So I'm just sewing with the raw edges even and using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So my stitch length is at 2.5, and I am using a 40 tex thread. This is 100% cotton. It's signature thread, and it's one that I use on the long arm. Here I have it. I'm using a Kona thread, and it's on a thread spool that's usually used for sergers. But this is an old one. It's used. It was given to me used, and it's plastic, and you can see every once in a while it starts bending forward, and I have to kind of flick it back, and I'm not sure. I think the thread is getting caught on the part of the stand there, so I need to replace that. Okay, this is a large quilt, so I have to do a lot of manipulating when I get to the corner. And here I'm mitering that corner and just going down the line. But I've got that entire quilt piled up on that 4-foot table, so there's just about 2 feet of it that I've got available to use. So it's all crunched up there, and it works okay. And I do have a 6-foot table that I used to work on that gave me a lot more room, but it doesn't fit very well in my quilting space down there. So I folded that up, and I haven't used it in a while. So I may be able to use that when we get moved to our new place, which will be next year sometime. But this just takes time. You can see the clock in the background as the time is ticking away. And I think it took, I don't know, a half hour or longer to put that binding on. And the thread color is just off-white. It, just kind of blends in with everything in that quilt. So nothing special there. And I'll move on forward ahead here to where I get to the end of the binding and kind of talk you through how I'm going about that. Okay, so here I am at the end of the binding. I've got the 2 pieces here. I'm overlapping them, so I have an idea of how much I need to trim off because there's a lot of extra binding. So I'm getting a little seam gauge here, and what I'm going to do is to measure down from the beginning of that overlap down 2 1/8 inches. So whatever the width of the binding is that you cut, that's how far you want to measure down from where they start overlapping. So on that top piece, I will measure from where it hits the bottom piece. I'll measure down 2 1/8 inches. So I got my little seam gauge there, and then I'm just going to mark that with a pencil, and then I'll trim it off. So I'm being very careful here, making sure that I've got it right, because if I cut it too short, the binding's going to be too short, and it's going to bunch up there. And if I cut it too long, the binding's going to be too long, and then I'll have to recut it. So going a little bit longer is better than going too short, but it's best to get it right in the first place. So here I've cut off all the extra binding, and you can see I've got quite a bit there. I think I had a full strip and then part of a second one. So now I'm going to put these 2 strips right sides together, and I'm going to form a 45-degree angle with them. So I'm opening the ends up, and then you'll see me turn them so that they are at a right angle to each other. And then I'm going to sew from corner to corner. This is a little hard to see. I didn't move the camera when I was doing this, but that's basically the gist of it. And you can draw a line there that you want to sew on. But here I'm showing those 2 pieces. They're at right angles. I got the raw edges even, and then I'm going to sew from one corner to the opposite corner, and that will make the miter. And then I will trim that and then press that seam open, and I just usually finger press that to get that right. So it's not difficult. The only difficult thing about it is the bulk of your quilt there. So you have to leave yourself enough free end on both ends of the binding so that you can pull them away from the quilt and sew them. And so here I'm clipping threads, and then I'll trim that seam. And I think I'm going to test it right here to make sure I've got it right after I get all my loose threads out of the way. There, I tested that and it looks like it's good. So now I'm going to go ahead and trim it. Now if it was too big, then I could take in a deeper seam, but that looked like it was going to work. So I'm just cutting that here. And then I will finger press that seam open and then finish sewing down the rest of that binding. So nothing too tricky about it. It just takes practice and you know, just take your time with it. So there's that diagonal seam, and then I'm pressing the fold there to make sure that lies flat, and then I'll just sew that down. And then here is the binding all sewed down and ready to be turned to the back side and then hand sewn down. So that went on really smoothly, and don't have any bumps or wrinkles or folds or anything in it. So what I usually do from here is I press that binding out, and then I will fold it over, and I clip it with my Wonder Clips, and then I hand sew it to the back with an applique stitch. So that'll be my next task, and then I'll have to do sew on some of the buttons, and I'll be done.
Thanks for watching. For more quilting ideas, click on the video links. And to keep up with my latest projects, click on the subscribe button. I hope to see you again soon.